On my wedding day, 40 minutes before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my sister sent me a text message designed to break me, wearing the dress uniform. "What are you trying to prove, Simone? That you're not woman enough for a real dress?" She didn't know that outside the chapel 500 people were already arriving. She didn't know they weren't coming for her. My name is Rear Admiral Simone Whitfield. I am 51 years old. I have served 27 years in the United States Navy, and this is the story of the day my family finally understood the difference between blood and honor. I stood in front of a full-length mirror in the small preparation room behind the chapel at Naval Station Norfolk, and I was not wearing silk. I was wearing the deep navy blue of my dress uniform, the gold stripes on my sleeve catching the afternoon light through the window. 2 silver stars sat on my shoulder boards, small and unassuming compared to what people imagine when they hear the word admiral, but to me they were not small at all. Each star represented more than a decade of service. Deployments, losses, nights I do not talk about. The uniform was not a costume. It was the truest thing I owned. Beyond the heavy doors, the chapel was filling, and at the end of the aisle, Marcus was waiting. My Marcus, a civilian data analyst who worked 2 floors below me at the Pentagon, a man who had never worn a uniform in his life but understood, somehow, the language of it anyway. He never asked me to be smaller. He never asked me to translate myself into something easier to love. For 1 full minute standing there in that quiet room, I let myself feel something I almost never allowed myself to feel. Peace. That peace lasted exactly as long as it took my phone to buzz against the vanity. My sister, Nadine. I had braced myself for something cutting. Nadine's cruelty usually came wrapped in something soft, something you could not quite report to anyone because it always came with plausible deniability. A joke, an eye roll, a well-meaning smile. But this was not soft. I read the words twice before they fully landed. Wearing the dress uniform. What are you trying to prove, Simone? That you're not woman enough for a real dress? The 3 dots appeared again almost instantly. A second message was already coming. You've spent your whole life trying to be one of the boys. You'll never actually be one of them, and now you won't even be a bride. Just a joke in a costume. My chest tightened. Costume. Joke. 2 words aimed with surgical precision at the exact center of everything I had built, my identity, my womanhood, my life's work, reduced to a punchline by someone who had known exactly where to aim since we were children. Nadine's text was the current that pulled me under, but it was my father who had opened the floodgates the night before. Gerald Whitfield did not call to congratulate me. He called the way he called his business partners, clipped, efficient, already thinking about the next item on his agenda. "Simone," he had said, skipping any pleasantry at all, "your mother and I expect you to make a sensible choice tomorrow. Some of my clients from the defense sector will be there. We cannot have this turn into a military spectacle." I remember the sound of ice shifting in a glass on his end of the line. Business as usual, even at 11 at night, even about his daughter's wedding. "Nadine has a point," he continued. "It's excessive. Wear a proper dress. Be a normal woman for 1 day. Don't embarrass this family." Embarrass the family, I had repeated, the words heavy in my mouth. As if 27 years of service was a liability to be managed rather than something to be proud of. He said nothing. And his silence was worse than anything he could have said. It was a verdict. It told me, without a single word, that 2 silver stars meant less to him than the opinion of men who wrote checks. I hung up the phone that night with my heart cracked clean down the middle, and I told myself I would not let it follow me into the chapel. It followed me into the chapel. A knock came at the door, gentle but certain, and I wiped my eyes quickly before it opened. Thomas Okafor stood there in his own dress uniform, though he had retired as a vice admiral 3 years earlier and technically owed no one this formality anymore. He had flown in from San Diego the night before without telling me he was coming. He looked at my face for exactly 1 second and understood everything. "Whitfield," he said, using my last name the way he always had ever since I was a young lieutenant terrified of disappointing him. "Whatever that phone did to you, leave it in this room. You are not walking out there as somebody's daughter or somebody's sister. You are walking out there as yourself." I nodded, because I did not trust my voice yet. He offered his arm instead of asking if I needed it, which was exactly the kind of quiet I needed in that moment, and together we stepped toward the doors of the chapel. The sound that greeted us was not the soft murmur of wedding guests making small talk. It was silence. A vast, deliberate, reverent silence, the kind that only comes from hundreds of people who have all decided, without being told, to hold their breath at the same time. 500 people, not 50. 500 sailors, Marines, airmen, soldiers, and Coast Guardsmen filling every pew, standing along every wall, spilling out through the open doors into the Virginia afternoon. I recognized faces from 3 different decades of my career. Weather chiefs standing shoulder to shoulder with young petty officers who had not even been born when I commissioned. None of them had been formally invited. Not one. A woman near the front stepped forward from the crowd. Master Chief Louisa Van, 38 years old, a scar still faintly visible along her jaw from a night in Helmand Province that neither of us would ever fully leave behind. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying easily through the silence, "we heard you might need people in your corner today." Behind her, 500 hands rose in a single motion, a sound like distant thunder, a wall of salutes held in absolute stillness. I felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with grief. My family of blood had made their judgment clear the night before. But this family of navy blue and gold, forged in places I still dream about, had shown up without being asked. And standing there, held upright by their loyalty, I finally let myself ask the question that had haunted every year of my life leading up to this one. Why is it always the people who share your blood who are the first ones who want to see you bleed? The answer to that question did not begin with cruelty. It began, the way most things with Nadine did, with a smile. And to understand it fully, you have to understand what our father expected of each of us long before either of us was old enough to have a say in it. My father grew up believing that a family, like a company, needed a clear division of labor. He never said it in those words, not directly, but it was there in every small decision he made as we grew up. Nadine was groomed, from almost the moment she could walk, to be presentable. Charming. The kind of daughter you could bring to a dinner with clients and trust to fill any silence gracefully. I was, without ever being told so outright, assigned the opposite role. The serious one. The capable one. The one whose feelings could apparently withstand more weight than hers. I do not say this to excuse what she did to me over the following decades. I say it because I did not understand it myself until much later, sitting across from a therapist of my own, finally asking out loud why my sister seemed to need my failure the way other people need air. Nadine spent her entire childhood being told in 100 small and unspoken ways that her value depended on how well she performed a version of femininity our father found acceptable, and that my existence, quiet and stubborn and increasingly uninterested in that performance, was some kind of threat to the deal she had been asked to keep. I was 7 years old and had no idea any of that was happening around me. I only knew that my sister's smile, more often than not, arrived right before something of mine got broken. I was 7 years old, standing beside a papier-mâché solar system I had spent 3 nights building in our garage in a small town outside Richmond, Virginia. Jupiter leaned slightly to one side. Saturn's rings were a little crooked, but it was mine. Every crooked, lopsided inch of it, and my teacher was telling my parents how proud they should be. Nadine was 9. She stood beside us, smiling the kind of smile grown-ups trust immediately. The moment my teacher turned away, Nadine's arm swung out, exaggerated, almost theatrical, and a full cup of orange soda arced through the air and landed directly in the center of my universe. The planets dissolved into a sticky orange pulp on the folding table. "Oh, Simone, I'm so sorry," she said, her eyes already wet with tears that had appeared from nowhere. "I'm such a klutz." My parents rushed to comfort her. "It's okay, sweetheart," my mother said, smoothing Nadine's hair. "Accidents happen." Then they turned to me, my own face streaked with real tears, and my father said the words that would become the theme of my entire childhood. "Don't make your sister feel bad, Simone. It was an accident." I stood there and understood something that no 7-year-old should have to understand yet. An apology could be a weapon. A smile could be a mask. By the time we were teenagers, her methods had refined themselves into something almost elegant. At 16, I brought home SAT scores that were nearly perfect, the kind of numbers that could open any door I wanted. My father, in a rare show of interest, asked about them at dinner. Before I could answer, Nadine cut in, her voice syrupy with false pride. "Simone's doing so well. She even made the wrestling team. She can pin boys twice her size." The table went quiet. A few uncles chuckled awkwardly. In a single sentence, she had taken my academic achievement and repackaged it as a joke about my masculinity, and my father, mortified, changed the subject to Nadine's debate trophy without a second thought. I sat there with a piece of turkey stuck in my throat, invisible at my own family's table. The year I turned 17, Nadine was crowned prom queen at our high school, a genuine achievement wrapped in the shimmering dress our mother had driven 3 hours to Richmond to buy. I had not been asked to prom and had no particular desire to go. I was perfectly content to spend the evening at home with a stack of library books about naval history instead. Nadine apparently could not allow me that peace either. In front of our parents, she put on a small performance of generous concern. Maybe Simone should come along anyway, she suggested, her smile radiating something that looked, on the surface, like kindness. She could help chaperone. She's so good at giving orders after all. The words wrapped in that smile were a quiet kind of public execution. It told everyone in the room without saying so directly that I did not belong among people my own age, that my natural place was on the sidelines, managing other people's fun rather than having any of my own. My mother, instead of noticing what had actually just happened, chimed in with real enthusiasm. "What a good idea! You should go, Simone. It could be fun for you." That night, I locked my bedroom door and turned my stereo up loud enough to drown out the sound of their laughter downstairs and the distant bass thumping from the gymnasium 3 miles away. I understood, with a clarity that frightened me a little, that this house was never going to be a place I could stay and also become myself. It was, in its own quiet way, a cage built out of expectation. My escape plan began that same week in the form of a secret application for a Navy ROTC scholarship. It was my way out, my one shot at a life built on merit instead of manipulation. I needed a letter of recommendation from a retired Navy captain who lived 2 streets over. When it arrived in the mail, Nadine intercepted it before I ever saw the envelope. My application came back marked incomplete. I found the letter 3 weeks later, crumpled at the bottom of her laundry hamper, stained with what I am fairly certain was nail polish remover. When I confronted her, she did not even look up from the fresh coat of red she was painting on her nails. "I was trying to help you," she said, her voice a calm, infuriating purr. "You're more fragile than you think you are. They would chew you up in that world. You'll thank me one day." Ugh, that arrogance. That casual assumption that she had the right to decide my future for me did not break me. It lit something. I smoothed out the crumpled letter as best I could, resubmitted my application with a new one, and swore to myself that whatever happened next, it would happen on my terms. Annapolis did not care about my last name. That was the first thing I loved about it, and the first thing that nearly broke me. The humid Maryland air clung to everything that first summer, and the instructors' voices carried across the yard before the sun was fully up. I was one of a small number of women in my company, and I quickly learned that my presence made some of my classmates uncomfortable in ways they were not always subtle about hiding. In the dining hall, I would catch fragments of conversation drifting from other tables, never quite loud enough to confront, always just loud enough to land, probably here to fill a quota. During tactics discussions, I noticed how my suggestions were sometimes met with a polite, empty stillness, as though I had spoken in a language no one in the room recognized, only to hear the exact same idea praised minutes later when it came from someone else. They called me Ice Queen behind my back, not because I was cold, but because I refused to laugh at jokes that made me the punchline, and refused to perform warmth I did not feel toward people who had not earned it. I ate alone most nights. I studied alone. I ran the seawall alone before dawn, when the only sound was my own breathing and the water hitting the rocks. My family had, without meaning to, given me one strange gift in all of this: a total indifference to being liked by people who had not bothered to know me. I decided early that I could not outmuscle anyone in that place. I could not win a shouting match with a 200-pound linebacker turned midshipman. So I decided to outthink, outprepare, and outlast every single one of them instead. I was the first one in the study hall each morning, the smell of stale coffee my only company, and the last to leave the library long after the lights in the barracks across the yard had gone dark. I memorized tide charts the way other people memorized song lyrics. I learned to break down and reassemble a service rifle blindfolded until the motion lived somewhere in my hands that did not require thinking at all. The test came during a 3-day land navigation exercise in the pine forests of southern Maryland, the kind of exercise designed to strip away every excuse you had ever made for yourself. A classmate named Trent Holloway, who had made it something of a personal mission to see me fail publicly, switched my compass for one with a subtly miscalibrated needle before we stepped off. I did not realize it until well after dusk on the first day, when my coordinates simply refused to line up with the terrain around me. Cold rain had started to fall. My hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden understanding that I was alone in the dark with no reliable way to find my way back. The anger that replaced the fear was clean and useful. I looked up through a gap in the tree cover and found the North Star. The same trick I had taught myself from library books during all those lonely nights I had spent alone as a teenager instead of at school dances. I oriented myself by the stars and started walking. I do not remember every hour of that night. I remember the sound my own heartbeat made in my ears, louder than the rain. I remember wading through waist-deep water somewhere near dawn, my boots filling with mud, briars tearing thin lines across my forearms that I would not fully notice until much later. I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me even at the time, that Trent's sabotage and Nadine's sabotage were built from the exact same material. Someone deciding, quietly and without my permission, that I could not be trusted with my own future, and taking it upon themselves to make that decision for me. The rage that thought produced was not loud. It was cold and precise, and it kept my feet moving when my body wanted to stop. On the morning of the third day, as Trent was quietly reporting me lost to the supervising instructor, I walked out of the tree line. My uniform was torn. My face was scratched and streaked with mud. My spine was straight. I set my grid sheet down on the instructor's table without a word, every waypoint marked with precision. The coordinates lining up exactly with the terrain I had actually crossed, rather than the fabricated readings from the compass I had abandoned somewhere in the second mile. The instructor, a grizzled chief who had never once used my rank instead of calling me by a nickname I will not repeat, looked me over slowly. Then he looked at Trent, then back at me. He picked up his own coffee mug and handed it to me without ceremony. "Good work, midshipman," he said, 2 words. But they were the first medal I had ever truly earned, paid for in mud and cold rain and a will that had refused to break. The real test came years later, and it did not ask for words. It asked for blood. I was a lieutenant commander by then, 34 years old, 11 years into a career I had built one earned inch at a time, flying MH-6DS rescue helicopters out of a forward operating base in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. My days were mostly logistics and mission planning, staring at digital maps in an air-conditioned trailer while other people went outside the wire. It was safer work. It was also work that never sat right with me. The air out there was its own particular character, a mix of diesel exhaust, dust so fine it worked its way into everything you owned, and a heat that pressed down on you even after the sun went low. I had planned dozens of routine flights by then, watched dozens of aircraft lift off into the haze while I stayed behind at a desk, doing my job well and hating almost every minute of it. The call came over the radio net like a lightning strike. A Marine reconnaissance team had been ambushed near a village on the outskirts of our operating area. Multiple casualties, pinned down under heavy fire. A rescue flight was being scrambled immediately, and the weather was already turning against us. I could have stayed at the trailer, coordinating from safety. That was, technically, my job that day. I looked at the flashing red icon on the screen instead, and I thought about the names attached to it, names I had helped assign to that patrol. I grabbed my flight gear and ran for the aircraft before I had fully decided to. The flight in was rough, low visibility, small arms fire cracking somewhere below us that we could hear but not see. Over the radio, I could hear panic starting to fray the edges of voices that were usually calm under pressure. Someone was requesting a status update on casualties that no one had time to answer yet. When we sat down near the ambush site, the ground team was already dragging their wounded toward the clearing, moving in the low, hunched way people move when the air itself feels dangerous. Master Chief Louisa Van, then a young petty officer, had a piece of shrapnel buried in her shoulder and was still trying to drag an unconscious Marine toward the helicopter under fire, her strength clearly failing. Her legs unsteady beneath her, there was no moment of deciding what to do next. I was out of my seat and running toward them before I had consciously chosen to move, the rotor wash tearing at my uniform, the ground kicking up in small, violent bursts around my boots. The ground erupted around me as we hauled both of them toward the aircraft. A piece of shrapnel caught my own arm just above the elbow, a hot, searing line of pain that I did not fully register until we were airborne again. my hand still locked around the strap I had used to help drag them both the last several yards. We got them both out. Van survived. The Marine survived. Neither of those outcomes felt guaranteed in the moment, and I have never quite stopped being grateful for how close it came to going the other way. I woke up 2 days later at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany with my arm in a sling and a quiet that felt entirely different from any silence I had known before. The other wounded service members in that ward, men and women carrying injuries far worse than mine, stopped looking through me the way people sometimes had for years. Something had shifted. A nurse a few days later told me, almost in passing, that the flight crew had started calling me a new name, not Ice Queen. Harbor. Because I had come back for them when the water got rough, and I had not left anyone behind. The weeks I spent recovering were strange, a paradox of pain and unexpected peace. My arm ached constantly, but for the first time in months, I slept in clean sheets without listening for incoming fire. The other patients in that ward, men and women carrying scars I could not always see, no longer looked through me. We traded quiet nods over bad coffee and found comfort in not needing to explain ourselves to each other. It was during that recovery that I first understood how deep the wound went for so many of the people around me. Physical injuries healed on a schedule you could track on a calendar. The other kind did not. A nurse turned on the television in the common room one afternoon, hoping to lift everyone's spirits, and there was my sister. Nadine sat on a bright morning talk show set, poised in a designer blazer, speaking with practiced warmth about resilience and the hidden strength of women who serve. Behind her, a photo filled the screen. My photo. Taken in the immediate aftermath of the ambush, my uniform torn, my face streaked with dirt and blood, my rank insignia cropped carefully out of frame. My sister, she said, gesturing to the image with genuine-looking emotion. She is an inspiration to all of us. The room went quiet. Every patient, every nurse, every visitor turned from the screen to look at me sitting in a wheelchair by the window. I did not feel proud. I felt exposed, stripped of context, hung up on display like a trophy that belonged to someone else. She called 2 days later. Her voice was honey over something colder underneath. Simone, darling, did you see the segment? I've already talked to a producer. We're going to do a whole documentary series, Women Who Broke Barriers. I'll executive produce it, of course. This is your moment. I listened to the pitch and asked myself one cold question. An icon for whom? She never once asked about my arm. She never asked if I was sleeping. She had simply found a story she could sell, built on the foundation of a wound that was not hers. My parents called soon after, their voices warmer toward me than I could remember them being in years. Nadine is doing such a wonderful thing for your career, honey, my mother said, and something in my chest went cold and hard and very, very clear. I called Nadine back. Listen to me carefully, I said, my voice flat and steady. My service, my scars, and the people I served with are not content for you to monetize. Do not use my image again. I hung up before she could answer, and then, with the same steadiness I used to plan a mission, I blocked her number, then my father's, then my mother's. The silence that followed felt like the first honest thing that had happened between us in years. When I left the hospital, I did not go back to the career track everyone expected of me. I turned down a comfortable staff assignment at the Pentagon, the kind of posting people spend their whole careers angling for, and asked instead for a transfer to a small, overlooked office inside Veterans Support Services. My colleagues thought I had lost my mind. It was widely understood to be a professional dead end. It was there in a cramped office with mismatched filing cabinets that I began what I privately called the Compass Point Initiative, named for the simple idea that everyone deserves a way to find true north again, even after the compass in their own mind has been shattered. It did not begin with a press release. It began with phone calls, coffee in cheap diners with recently separated veterans who had nowhere else to put their questions. Mostly, it began with listening. That is how I met Daniel Cho. We met in a diner outside Norfolk with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that had clearly been sitting on the burner too long. Daniel had been a sonar technician, 3 deployments, hands that used to be able to isolate a single anomalous signal out of an ocean of noise. Now those same hands shook so badly he could barely lift his coffee cup without spilling it. He told me about the nights that would not end, lying awake, replaying decisions he had made under pressure, wondering if a different choice would have saved someone. He told me about the panic that could seize him without warning in a crowded grocery store for reasons his own body refused to fully explain to him. He said the hardest part was not any single memory. It was the quiet in between them, the ordinary Tuesday afternoons where nothing was wrong and he still felt like he was underwater. The official system had processed him efficiently, a prescription, a pamphlet about readjusting to civilian life. Nothing that acknowledged the actual size of what he was carrying, and nothing that seemed to understand that asking for help still felt to him like admitting he had failed at the one thing he had trained his entire adult life to be good at. I listened to him for hours that first day, not as an officer to a subordinate, but as one person who understood loss talking to another. I did not offer him easy answers because I did not have any. What I offered instead was time, and the simple, unglamorous promise that I would show up again the following week, and the week after that, for as long as it took. He did show progress, slowly, in the months that followed. He started sleeping in longer stretches. He started a part-time job at a hardware store near his apartment, and the first time he told me about a customer he had helped without his hands shaking. His voice caught with something that sounded almost like disbelief at himself. Word about our small, unofficial network spread the way these things do among people who have served, quietly, through trust rather than advertising. Within a year, I was meeting with a dozen veterans a month in that same diner and 2 others like it, connecting them with therapists I had personally vetted for understanding military culture, people who did not flinch at language or start every session by asking someone to rate their pain on a scale of 1 to 10 as though that could capture any of it. Around that same time, I came across a video online. Nadine, keynote speaker at a wellness conference in California, immaculate in white, speaking to a rapt audience about authentic listening and emotional resilience in the digital age. The crowd gave her a standing ovation. I felt something close to nausea watching it. She, who had never once truly listened to another human being in her life, was being celebrated for teaching people how. I found out later from a mutual acquaintance that her company was quietly drowning in debt. The wellness conferences, the branded retreats, all of it built on financing that was starting to come due. She needed something to reignite the brand. She needed, as it turned out, a story that was not hers to tell. The tragedy I had been fighting to prevent arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that gives no warning at all about what it is about to take from you. The call came from Daniel's mother, her voice shattered in a way I will never fully be able to describe. He was gone. He had ended his own life in the quiet of his apartment, 2 weeks after telling me, over that same cracked vinyl booth, that things finally felt like they might be getting a little easier. She sent me the letter he had left behind. Most of it was apology, addressed to people who loved him and would now carry a grief that never fully closes. At the very end, one line was addressed to me. Admiral Whitfield was the only one who ever made me feel like I was actually seen. I sat with that letter for a long time before I could make myself put it down. I kept thinking about all the small progress we had made, the job, the sleep, the way his voice had sounded the last time we spoke, and how none of it had been enough to hold against whatever finally caught up to him in the quiet of that apartment. I have learned since then that recovery from this kind of wound is rarely a straight line, and that even real progress does not guarantee the outcome any of us are hoping for. It does not mean the effort was wasted. It means the need for this work is even more urgent than I had already believed it to be. The grief I felt for him hardened, over the following weeks, into something colder and more useful. My fight was no longer a side project I fit in around my real career. It was the entire mission now. If you are listening to this and you are carrying something you have not said out loud yet, I want you to know that what you are feeling has a name, and it is not weakness. If today is hard, please reach out to someone, a friend, a chaplain, the Veterans Crisis Line. You are not required to carry it alone, and there are people who have been exactly where you are who are still here to help you find your way back. The War for Compass Point Initiative's official recognition looked nothing like any war I had fought before. My opponents were not insurgents. They were well-fed officers with more stars than mine, congressional staffers with tight schedules, and the vast, patient bureaucracy of the Pentagon itself. I presented proposals in cold conference rooms to rows of politely skeptical faces. It's not in this budget cycle, Admiral. This falls outside our current strategic priorities. The words changed slightly each time, but the meaning underneath them stayed the same. Mental health was still, in too many rooms, treated as a personal failing rather than an injury earned in service. It was in one of those meetings, a briefing on data infrastructure of all things, that I met Marcus Reyes. He was a civilian analyst for the Department of Defense, quiet, precise, unimpressed by rank in a way I found immediately refreshing. He did not offer platitudes about my cause. He asked sharp, specific questions about funding models and measurable outcomes, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, someone was looking at Compass Point not as a charity project, but as what it actually was, a serious operational necessity. We started having lunch together in the crowded Pentagon cafeteria. Our conversations mixed military acronyms with statistical models in a way that probably made no sense to anyone listening in. But underneath the technical language, something real was building. He proposed on an ordinary Tuesday night while we were making pasta in my kitchen, a wooden spoon still in his hand. "Should we make this official?" he asked in the same tone he might have used to suggest we buy a new couch. It remains the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. I said yes without a single moment of hesitation. When the engagement became public, Nadine, whose company was by then in serious financial trouble, launched her most public attack yet. She posted a photo online, combat boots set deliberately beside an elegant slice of wedding cake, with a caption dripping in sarcasm about marrying the military instead of a man. She tagged it with a label meant to invite ridicule. "Commanding bride." The post spread quickly. Gossip accounts picked it up. For a few hours, the humiliation felt total. Ugh. But then something shifted, the way tides sometimes do without warning. Veterans, military spouses, and active duty service members I had never met took the label she had meant as an insult and claimed it for themselves. A hashtag started trending, photos of women in uniform on their own wedding days, captions reclaiming the phrase as a badge of pride instead of shame. My office email filled with messages of support, not just from sailors I had led, but from service members across every branch. Several offered, unprompted, to fly in and stand as an honor guard at my wedding if I would have them. Nadine's attempt to shrink me in public had, instead, revealed exactly how many people refused to let her. I want to pause the story here, because what happened next is the part I am proudest of, and it did not happen by accident, and it did not happen because of me alone. A few weeks before the wedding, my friend Priya Nair, a Navy JAG officer I had known since our first duty station together, called me late one evening. Priya has the particular calm of someone who has spent a career reading contracts for the sentence that will hurt you later. "Simone," she said, "I need you to send me everything Nadine has published using your image and your service record, all of it." I did not fully understand why until she explained it to me the following week, sitting across from me at my kitchen table with a folder of printed screenshots between us. "What your sister is doing goes past bad taste," Priya said, tapping one of the printed pages. "She is using your likeness without consent for commercial promotion, and in at least 2 interviews, she has implied she has first-hand knowledge of combat operations she was never part of. That gets close to some very specific legal problems, both for her business and potentially under statutes protecting how military service is represented publicly." I turned one of the pages toward myself. It was a screenshot from a podcast appearance Nadine describing in vivid and entirely invented detail what it apparently felt like to wait at home while a loved one deployed to a combat zone, speaking as though she had lived it herself rather than simply narrated her sister's life on a screen. "I want to be careful here because I do not believe in cruelty for its own sake," I told her. "She is still my sister." Priya set the folder down and looked at me directly. "This isn't cruelty, Simone," she said gently. "This is a boundary with paperwork behind it. You have spent your whole career teaching young officers that consequences are not the same thing as revenge. Consequences are just what happens when someone finally has to answer for a choice they made. You didn't create this situation. She did, a long time before you ever called me." I sat with that for a long moment, turning my coffee cup slowly in my hands. "Draft it," I said finally. "Send it exactly the way you would send it to a stranger." She drafted a formal cease and desist letter on my behalf, laying out in careful legal language exactly what needed to stop and exactly what would happen if it did not. She sent it to Nadine's production company and to the network that had been developing the documentary series. The response was immediate and, frankly, larger than I expected. The network's legal department, unwilling to absorb the risk, quietly pulled out of the project within the week. A sponsor who had been funding Nadine's wellness retreats followed soon after, citing, in careful corporate language, concerns about brand alignment. I did not gloat when I heard. I felt something closer to sorrow, watching a structure my sister had built on borrowed foundations finally give way under its own weight. A mutual acquaintance told me weeks later that Nadine had been forced to issue a public statement clarifying her actual role in the projects she had implied she was part of, and that the wellness company she had built her entire public identity around was quietly winding down for good. The retreats canceled the branded merchandise pulled from her online store. It was not revenge. It was accountability, arriving several decades late, but arriving nonetheless in the form of legal letters and canceled contracts rather than shouting matches or public confrontations. I have come to believe that is usually how real accountability looks: quiet, procedural, almost anticlimactic from the outside and entirely undeniable from the inside. The morning of the wedding, Master Chief Van met me for coffee before anyone else was awake, dressed in civilian clothes but standing the way people stand who have spent their whole adult lives in uniform, even when they are not wearing one. "Ma'am," she said, "everything is handled. Base Commander approved the chapel and grounds 3 days ago. Compass Point family started reaching out through the private group as soon as word got around. We're not expecting a crowd. We're expecting a formation." I asked her, half joking, how exactly 500 people organize themselves without a single official order. "They don't need an order, ma'am," she said simply. "You gave them something worth showing up for a long time before today." I did not have words for that. I only nodded and let her refill my coffee. The chapel that afternoon was, as promised, filled with navy blue and gold and the deep green of Marine Corps dress uniforms, standing room only, spilling out onto the steps into the bright Virginia sun. My parents and Nadine sat in the family pew near the front, small and out of place among a sea of people who had traveled on their own time and their own money simply because they refused to let me walk in there without them. From a crack in the preparation room door, I watched Nadine's practiced composure crack for just a moment as she took in the size of the crowd. This was supposed to have been her spectacle to narrate. Instead, she had become an audience member to something entirely outside her control. When the doors finally opened, there was no organ music. Instead, a single voice called out across the chapel, "Attention on deck." 500 people rose as one, a sound like a wave breaking, and 500 hands snapped into a salute so precise it seemed to shake the old wooden beams above us. I walked down that aisle through a corridor of people I had served beside in deserts and mountains and open ocean, past faces that held no idle curiosity, only loyalty, and I did not look once toward the family pew. In that moment, they had simply ceased to be the center of anything. I recognized a chief who had served under me on my very first ship. I recognized a young ensign who had gone through Compass Point's program the year before, standing tall now in a uniform he had once told me he was not sure he would live long enough to wear again. I thought, walking past them, about my father's warning the night before: "Do not turn this into a military parade." He had not been entirely wrong. It simply was not the insult he had intended it to be. Marcus waited for me at the end of the aisle, steady, smiling, unimpressed by ceremony, and entirely present for me. Our vows were not about riches or obedience. We promised, instead, to be each other's safe harbor in every storm still ahead of us, a term that made the entire congregation of service members quietly smile, because they understood exactly what it meant coming from me. When the chaplain pronounced us married, the applause shook the chapel. As we turned to leave, an arch of sabers waited outside, dozens of officers forming a glittering tunnel of steel that stretched from the chapel doors out into the sunlight. I caught one last glimpse of Nadine near the back of the crowd, no longer seated with the family, standing instead at the edge of everything, arms crossed tightly, face unreadable. Our eyes met for 1 second. Then she turned and disappeared into the dispersing crowd. She had not lost to a single word I said to her. She had lost to the plain, undeniable truth of a life she had spent 30 years trying to diminish and had never once managed to touch. The reception was held in an aircraft hangar on base, long folding tables instead of centerpieces, coolers of ice instead of a string quartet. It was loud with the particular kind of joy that comes from people who have survived things together. Master Chief Van found me at some point in the evening gripping my hand in both of hers. "Thank you for flying out for my father's funeral last year, ma'am," she said. "I never forgot that." A young pilot, barely 25, told me my career was the reason she had applied for flight school in the first place. An older chief warrant officer I barely recognized reminded me of a training exercise from 15 years earlier where I had, apparently, spent an extra hour after hours making sure he understood a navigation problem he'd been too embarrassed to ask about twice. I did not remember it. He remembered every detail. It was not a wedding reception so much as a living record of a legacy I had built, one unremarkable, unseen decision at a time. The kind of decisions that never make it into an efficiency report or promotion board packet but apparently outlast almost everything else. Later that night, long after the last folding table had been cleared away, Marcus and I sat together in our hotel room, the noise of the day finally settling into something quieter. I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt strangely hollow. "I feel empty," I admitted, my voice smaller than I intended it to be. Marcus took my hand without saying anything for a moment. "Every war has an aftermath," he said finally. "You've spent so long being ready to fight. Now you get to learn how to live in the peace you actually won." My parents had left immediately after the ceremony without saying goodbye, which was less a surprise than a confirmation of something I'd already accepted a long time ago. The next morning, I sat by the window of our hotel room, watching the gray water of the harbor move steadily out toward the sea. I opened my phone, scrolled to my parents' names, numbers I had kept through every deployment, every silent holiday, holding on to some small, unreasonable hope that one day they might call just to say they were proud. That day, I finally understood, was never going to come on its own. I deleted both numbers. There was no anger in it, just a quiet, deliberate release of something I had been carrying much longer than I needed to. An email arrived almost the moment I finished. The subject line was a single word, Nadine. I braced myself for another blow and almost deleted it unread. Curiosity won out instead. There was no sarcasm this time, no performance. It was short, and it was honest in a way nothing from her had ever been before. "Father told me yesterday that I embarrassed him," it read. For the first time in my life, I understood he was wrong about who the embarrassment actually was. "They didn't stand up for the stars on your shoulders, Simone. They stood up because you had already stood up for them, over and over, long before any of them knew your name. We don't salute blood. We salute the truth when we finally see it." It was not an apology. It was something closer to a surrender, offered on her own terms and no one else's. I sat with that email for a long time, the harbor water still moving quietly outside the window, and I let it be exactly what it was, not love, not forgiveness, not yet, but respect, finally, arriving decades late. Years passed the way they do, quietly and then all at once. The conflicts that had shaped my early career faded from the headlines, replaced by new ones. I found myself, eventually, in an office on an upper floor of the Pentagon with a clear view of the Potomac River, no longer fighting for a seat at the table but chairing the meetings myself. Compass Point Initiative was no longer a side project funded out of my own savings. It had become official Department of Defense policy, mandatory across every branch, credited by that point with intervening in thousands of cases before they became tragedies. The work was still hard. It simply belonged to me now rather than being something I had to beg permission to do. One spring afternoon, I was invited to speak at the United States Naval Academy, the same institution that had once quietly called me ice clean behind my back. I stood in front of thousands of young midshipmen, most of them not yet old enough to fully understand what the next decade of their lives was going to ask of them, and I did not talk about tactics. I talked about Daniel Cho. I told them his real name with his mother's blessing because I believe the people we lose deserve to be remembered as themselves and not as cautionary statistics. I told them that the bravest thing a leader can do is not charge toward danger, but build a space safe enough for the people under their command to admit they are hurting, and to actually mean it when they say their door is open. I told them that 27 years earlier I had stood in a room not unlike this one, certain that no one in it believed I belonged there, and that the only thing that had ever mattered in the end was whether I believed it myself on the days when no one else did. When I finished, the entire hall rose in applause that felt, for the first time in a long career of formal recognitions, like an actual validation of everything the work had cost. Scanning the crowd afterward, I found a familiar face in the guest section. Nadine. Older now, softer around the edges, dressed simply, without the polish I remembered from her television appearances. She was standing. She was clapping. Our eyes met across the crowded hall for a long moment. Neither of us moved to close the distance. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something more honest than that. Respect, paid for, slowly, over the course of an entire lifetime. After the speech, while I was still shaking hands near the stage, a sharp-looking young officer approached me, her uniform crisp, her handshake firm. "Admiral Whitfield," she said. "My name is Lieutenant Junior Grade Ava Ramos. My mother is Master Chief Louisa Van." My breath caught for a moment. I remembered Van's face vividly, the shrapnel wound, the desperate crawl toward the aircraft years ago in Helmand. "She told me the story of the day you carried her out more times than I can count. Growing up," the young officer continued, a small smile at the corner of her mouth, "she always said you were the definition of what a leader should actually look like. When I was born, she gave me the middle name, Harbor." She squared her shoulders in a gesture that made my chest ache with recognition. "You're the reason I'm standing here today, ma'am." I looked at this capable young woman, ready to lead sailors of her own, and understood, finally, what my legacy actually was. Not the stars on my shoulders, not the policy memos with my signature at the bottom. This, standing right in front of me, alive and full of promise. The final circle closed a year later, at a ceremony marking my retirement after 30 years of service. As the formal program wound down and the crowd began to thin, a man I had not spoken to in years approached me slowly through the room. He was older now, his shoulders less certain than I remembered them. The formidable presence of my childhood softened almost entirely by age. "My father." "Simone," he said, his voice unsteady in a way I had genuinely never heard from him before. I was wrong. He looked down at his hands, then back up at me, his eyes carrying the particular weight of decades of things left unsaid. "I spent so much of my life focused on how things looked instead of what they actually meant," he said. "I couldn't see what was standing right in front of me the whole time." He took a breath that shook slightly on its way out. "I am so proud of you. I should have said that a very long time ago." He reached out and pulled me into a hug that was awkward and unpracticed. The kind of hug that comes from someone who has genuinely never done this before, but sincere in a way that reached me anyway. It was, more or less, the hug I had been waiting for since I was 7 years old, standing in front of a ruined science project. That night, sitting quietly beside Marcus, I found myself thinking back to Nadine's email from all those years earlier. "We don't salute blood. We salute the truth when we finally see it." She had been right in her own late, complicated way. My entire life had been a long, difficult argument in favor of exactly that idea. Argued not in a courtroom or a boardroom, but in diners and forests and cockpits and a small, cramped office nobody wanted. One unremarkable decision at a time. I thought about the 7-year-old girl standing over a ruined solar system, learning far too early that an apology could be a weapon. I thought about the young officer nobody wanted to call by her rank, walking out of a dark forest with mud in her boots and the truth in her hands anyway. I thought about a young sonar technician in a diner with shaking hands, and how some of what we build in this life is measured not in what we manage to save, but in what we refuse to stop trying to save even after loss teaches us how much it can cost. I thought, too, about forgiveness and about how long it had taken me to understand that forgiveness and reconciliation are not always the same gift. I have not fully reconciled with my sister, not in the way daytime television might lead you to expect a story like this one to end. We do not call each other on Sundays. We do not send birthday cards. But something between us finally settled into something honest. And for two people who spent 30 years speaking almost entirely in weapons, honest was its own kind of miracle. The sweetest kind of victory, I have come to understand, was never really about winning. It was about truth. It was about the particular unglamorous strength it takes to stand in your own honor, even when the people who should have handed it to you freely never did, and to show other people by example that they can do the same. It was about learning, slowly and imperfectly, that the goal was never to make my family finally see me. The goal was to build a life so honestly mine that whether they saw it or not stopped being the question that decided my worth. If there is one thing this journey has taught me, it is this. You are the only author your own honor will ever truly have. The voices from your past or your present that try to make you smaller can be loud, sometimes for years at a time, sometimes from people who are supposed to love you the most. But the truth of who you actually are, forged in your own fires and paid for in your own currency, will always, eventually, be louder, even if it takes decades to hear it clearly. This is my story, but I know I am far from the only one who has had to fight this particular kind of battle, the quiet one, fought inside families instead of on any battlefield anyone gives you a medal for. I know there are people listening tonight who understand exactly what it feels like to sit at a table where your accomplishments get quietly rewritten into something smaller, something safer for everyone else to be around. I know there are people listening who are still waiting for a phone call that may never come, and I want you to know that waiting does not make you weak. It only means you loved people who were not always capable of loving you back the way you deserved. If tonight's story found something true in you, I hope you will carry a piece of it forward. Build the thing only you can build. Answer the call only you would answer. And if you are the one still waiting for someone in your own family to finally see you clearly, I hope with everything I have that you find your own 500 people. I promise you, they are out there, closer than you think, and some of them are already looking for you too. Thank you for listening.